Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Allison McNaughton. I'm a fisheries consultant with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and I will be your host today for this session. We have quite an interesting and dynamic panel activity planned for today. Today's session focuses on action, innovation, and learning to address the interlinked challenges of climate change, vulnerability, and poverty that are being faced by small-scale fishers and coastal communities in small island developing states and beyond, as they work to maintain sustainable livelihoods through the production of aquatic foods. Our keynote speaker and invited panelists will discuss some recent experiences and share priorities for moving forward on work related to these themes. Among the topics to be covered are climate change and poverty interactions, vulnerability, and how they are impacting coastal communities and SIDS, as well as what needs to be done and why this is so important now more than ever. Panelists will highlight some of their experiences and recommendations on practical steps towards solutions, including intersectoral collaboration, data collection and engagement initiatives, governance and institutional strengthening, social protection, and as well as identifying gaps and entry points to support fisher well-being. This session also marks the launch of a new self-paced course, online course, addressing the climate change and poverty nexus. We would like the session to be as dynamic and interactive as possible. We want you to know as the audience that we appreciate your engagement, and so we encourage you to introduce yourselves and share your comments in the chat. You can also pose questions to the speakers and panelists using the Q&A function, the question and answer function, which you'll find just at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Zoom functions. We'll do our best during the session to share some of these questions as they come up and to have the panelists respond in their remarks or through the Q&A function. So please do make use of it and follow along to see the questions and responses. And now let's begin. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Renata Clark, the FAO Sub-Regional Coordinator for the Caribbean, who will share some opening keynote remarks. Dr. Clark, over to you.
Thank you. Climate change and variability in the SIDS are disproportionately impacting vulnerable groups such as small-scale farmers and coastal communities, contributing to worsening poverty and food insecurity. We keep hearing and speaking about the imperative of investing in resilience, but we're not doing enough or well enough. I was speaking recently with someone who reminded me of the old adage, "Tell me 1,000 times or show me once." I returned a few weeks ago from Dominica, where the signs of hurricanes past are all too evident. Businesses destroyed, livelihoods destroyed, markets lost. It really hits you in the gut, the imperative to invest sufficiently and intelligently in resilience. We need to create systems such that communities lose less and recover faster, systems that safeguard the vulnerable. We will only be able to plan adequately for building resilience if we get better at thinking laterally and working across sectors to identify risks and plan effectively to reduce and mitigate negative impacts. That better thinking needs to start sooner rather than later. FAO recently implemented a pilot version of the course addressing the climate and poverty nexus in collaboration with the University of the West Indies. The collaboration was with the new Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilient Development and the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, CERMES. I would like to take a moment here to acknowledge the contributions of the late Dr. Hugh Seeley and Dr. Patrick McConney. Working with these exceptional professionals has always been a learning journey. The pilot was a special tutored version of the online course and included webinars with invited speakers, as well as weekly live virtual seminars where participants and instructors met to discuss and share experiences with climate and poverty related issues in their own work and the approaches they are taking to address them. Course participants included a range of professionals, many specialists in their fields, from countries across the region and working in many different sectors. This included people working with fisheries, climate change, social policy, planning, urban development, universities, conservation NGOs, and humanitarian organizations. The course provided a space for peer-to-peer exchange and thinking across disciplines. This kind of intersectoral interaction and collaborative learning is one of the key areas we need to focus on, fostering and supporting if we are to succeed in addressing current challenges. Climate vulnerability and food security issues cannot be solved by single sector approaches. During the panel dialogue, we will hear more on this from two of the pilot course alumni who have been working on implementation of their own climate poverty approaches. With today's session, we are very pleased to announce that FAO, in collaboration with the Global Institute for Climate, Smart and Resilient Development and CERMES of the University of the West Indies, are launching a new self-paced version of the course, which will go live today for global audience. This is a 5-unit course that covers a lot of ground, providing an introduction to climate poverty interactions and entry points for addressing them through more integrated, multi-sectoral approaches, so that policies, investments, and programs have greater impact on rural poverty reduction and climate change adaptation, mitigation, and the interactions between the two. The course aims to support conceptual knowledge and awareness, as well as more applied skills and practical tools, and overall to support and inspire participants to take steps to improve the ways in which the climate poverty nexus is recognized and addressed in their own work. Depending on your specific interests, you can learn about climate poverty vulnerability assessment, early warning systems, shock responsive social protection, building policy coherence for integrated approaches, integrating fisheries into national adaptation planning, and more. We invite all of you to join us and explore this important new learning course following this session. And I look forward to hearing the discussions that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for your remarks. It's really good to hear about the collaboration around the course. If there are questions for Dr. Clark or comments, you can share those in the Q&A, and she will be staying with us for the remainder of the session. So also we can, have some more further discussion on initiatives in the Caribbean, if audience members are interested or have questions about that as well. So setting the scene for the discussion today, in today's panel discussion, we will be talking about climate shocks and stressors and their interactions with poverty and vulnerability. The focus is on coastal communities and SIDS, and specifically on supporting sustainable livelihoods, fisher well-being, and the production of aquatic foods. Panelists are going to be talking about entry points and sharing practical examples of the processes and tools, as Dr. Clark mentioned, that they have been applying in their own work. This is going to include a special focus on social protection for the fisheries sector and how this represents a key investment towards improved resilience and well-being. So once again, just a reminder to the audience, if you would like, we welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat and feel free to share comments throughout, and please make use of the Q&A function. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. If we can turn to panel view, gallery view. Joining us today are Dr. Anthony Charles, a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada, and one of the authors of the FAO report addressing the climate change and poverty nexus. Also, Mrs. Shelley Ann Edwards, Program Director for the Poverty Reduction Coordinating Unit at the Planning Institute of Jamaica and one of our course alumni. Dr. Sharon Hutchinson, Head of the Department of Agriculture, Economics and Extension in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture at the University of West Indies and another of our course alumni. Dr. Daniela Kalikowski, a Fisheries Officer with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. And Mr. Sebastian Matthew, Executive Director of the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, ICSF, representing a network globally of fisher organizations. Welcome, panelists. It's so good to have you here with us today. Now let's begin. Sebastian and Sharon, I'm going to ask you to start things off for the discussion. We're going to ask, what can you tell us about the most pressing issues being faced today by small-scale fishers and small island developing states in terms of climate change impacts and the relationships with livelihoods, vulnerability, poverty, and ultimately with fisher well-being and food security? Sebastian, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, good evening from India, and thank you for having us at this very important discussion. I think a recent observation by the African Natural Resources Center of African Development Bank I think summarizes the importance of fisheries in the SIDS context. So in light of COVID, the African Natural Resources Center observed that fishery was the only intact pillar of the economy able to generate revenue 2 months into the pandemic. So everything else came to a standstill, including tourism and other activities, and fisheries was the only activity which was able to feed, which was able to generate revenue. So that clearly shows that for the SIDS, fisheries is a very important sector. And then if you get into further details, you can see that half of the animal protein of all people in SIDS actually comes from aquatic foods. So therefore, it's a very important source of animal protein for people living in SIDS. And then if you look at the numbers, very important that they have a very large number of subsistence fishers. Perhaps one of the largest numbers of subsistence fishers are in the SIDS area. They have a large number of small-scale fishers, and they also have a small number of fishers working on industrial fishing vessels who are also denizens of these areas. And if you look at the share of the fishers in the SIDS population, it may not be very high if you look at the region. It's about 0.5% if you take the total population and number of fishers as a percentage of that. But you look at countries like Nauru, 36% of the population of Nauru are fishers. Or you look at Marshall Islands, 8.5% of the population are fishers in Marshall Islands. Therefore, the number of fishers varies from country to country. Some islands it is negligible, some places very high. So there's high diversity of fishers participating in small-scale fisheries. And then I think if you look at the share of fisheries to GDP, FAO Sofia report 2022 shows that globally fisheries is contributing 0.1% of GDP. But if you look at SIDS, it's 0.46%. So that's about 5 times the global average in SIDS. Therefore, it again highlights the importance of fisheries in the SIDS region. And then if you look at the assessment report 6, it clearly highlights some of the points that we are going to address. It talks about how there is destruction of terrestrial, marine, and coastal biodiversity in the region, and as a result, how the ecosystem services are getting affected. And when you talk about ecosystem services, it talks about the food supply, it talks about the water, it talks about how you regulate the nutrient cycle in the sea. So there are so many aspects of the ecosystem services are disrupted. And this has a very, very strong impact on the livelihood of fishers. And considering the fact that it is a very important kind of a sector in the region. So this kind of destruction of the ecosystem services have a huge impact on the livelihood of fishers. And then there's also, there are other issues like habitability of reef and non-reef islands. The AR6 talks about how there is a very large increase in displacement of people from these islands. So therefore, there will be kind of environmental refugees from these areas. So therefore, and there is water security issues in many islands. So therefore, these are some of the reasons which are very, very pronounced. And for all these reasons, I think we need to make sure that the fisheries sector is protected, in terms of better adaptation. And maybe mitigation level, we don't have much to contribute to, but definitely at the level of adaptation, fisheries sector have a lot to benefit from, not only at the national level, but also from the international community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. You make some really good points. The importance of small-scale fisheries for their contributions to aquatic foods globally, and then especially in SIDS. Sharon, in your experience as a researcher and practitioner working with small-scale fishers and coastal communities in Trinidad, how do you see this? What do you think, what are the most pressing issues that you're observing in the places that you work, and what do you think most needs to be done?
Thank you, Alison. I think many small-scale fisheries, such as those in the Caribbean and around the world, they're experiencing declines in landings for some key species. And some of these declines may be due to stock issues where the stock may be in decline because of overfishing, but there's the potential that some of these issues are because of redistribution of fish. One of the potential impacts of climate change is that fish is expected to migrate out of the tropical region towards the temperate regions. So areas such as the Caribbean, we expect to see a decline in our overall fish stock, but we don't have the science clear at the local level. So for example, we haven't been able to identify which species, for example, the most impacted by this migration. And this is a very pressing issue for our local communities. Another important aspect, as Dr. Clark had mentioned, was this, we have limited resilience. So being in areas which are prone to have hurricanes and storms, you could see that generally the impact has been due to storm surges. Storm surges have in fact caused a lot of destruction when they do occur. So it's not just the wind damage, but also the storm surge damage. And much of the fish infrastructure, like fish markets, the landing sites and so, they are wide open. They're not well protected from these natural disasters. And because many fishers do not have insurance of any kind, no personal insurance, no health insurance, no life insurance, and several don't have any insurance for their boats or engines, you find that these fishers sometimes leave fishing after they get a serious setback from a storm or hurricane, or they take a very long time to get back into fishing if they, let's say they've lost their vessel. So getting more social protection for them, more social support, where they're able to support their families in the event of a loss is actually a very pressing issue that is affecting many small-scale fishers around the world. I think many of them need to have some kind of insurance to give their families that support, because in most cases, fishing is the main source of income. In our Caribbean sphere, you would find fishing accounting in some areas to like 80% of the community income, for example, which really means that whole communities are depending on this single activity. And then the other pressing issue is that with the expected rise in sea surface temperatures, and also with the potential for increased acidification, you find that we may lose coral reefs, and coral reefs are important habitat areas for fishers and fisheries. So that in the Caribbean, for example, we expect significant coral reef loss if the global targets of meeting this 1.5 degrees Celsius increase is surpassed. And that potential increase in temperature and subsequent loss of coral reefs is expected to have a significant blow on tourism that relies on corals and ecosystem services surrounding that. But more importantly, it will affect fish stock. And we need some more science to support the expected impacts of this, because that directly links back to incomes for fishers and fishing communities. So back to you, Alison.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, those are some really important points. I know that issue of insurance that you mentioned, we're going to be talking about that in a little bit, in a lot more detail coming up in the discussion. I want to open the floor now to all panelists. If anyone has any additional comments that they'd like to make here on this issue of, the key pressing issues that you see with respect to the interactions of climate change impacts and vulnerability for small-scale fishers. Panelists?
Good morning, everyone. From Jamaica. I just want to underscore some of the points that were raised by my fellow panelists. We definitely need to underscore the fact that we are in SIDS, right? And we are definitely affected by the impacts of climate change. We must also note that the poor and vulnerable are disproportionately affected. We take, for example, Jamaica, that sits within a hurricane belt. And we also look at the vast number of persons who live close to coastlines. We look at the exploitation of our natural resources, and these lead to increased vulnerability. We also look at the heavily heavy reliance on climate sensitive sectors such as agriculture and tourism. And due to all of those, we must recognize that we must look at specific and very pertinent responses. Some of these include ensuring that we do vulnerability assessments. And these are important for helping to highlight where the resources need to be placed and who would be most affected. We must also look at an integrative approach, a multi-stakeholder approach, ensuring that all stakeholders are involved in this process, from the planning process, identifying what the issues are, to the responses. And we will hear definitely more about that as we go along. So just wanted to add those points.
Thank you, Shelley-Ann. That's great. I know what you said about vulnerability assessments, especially. Can I come back to you with a follow-up question on that? When you say vulnerability assessments, you're talking about assessment that puts together the impacts on people who are experiencing poverty and marginalization, in addition to the climate impacts more generally. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, that is what I'm saying, but also looking at communities in particular and sectors that are also vulnerability. I know when we speak about vulnerability in the context of climate change, it may mean one thing, and in the context of social protection, it may mean another thing, but we definitely have to look at both the communities and the vulnerable groups, you know, that are vulnerable to social protection risks and shocks, and also those that are vulnerable to climate change. So it is both. In Jamaica, we have done a number of vulnerability assessments looking at sectors such as water, tourism, health, agriculture, coastal resources, and human settlement. Those have been done to ensure that we can identify, you know, which areas are most vulnerable, and so the response can be appropriate.
And does that happen together in Jamaica with for fisheries as well? Or are they sort of separate assessments that happen?
Right. So we also have the assessment that take into consideration the fisheries as well as the communities in general. So it is an integrated approach that we have been looking at. We also have a project that is looking at building resilience at the community level among fishers and other vulnerable groups, including women, including those within the broader sector. And definitely we have to look at a more integrated approach. So while we're looking at it from the community standpoint, we have to ensure that we have all the various families, fishers, etc., who are being impacted by the fact that, you know, we are in a vulnerable situation climate-wise, and also the issue of poverty. As I mentioned, several persons who are poor live along the coasts, are in fishing villages and fishing dependent communities, and therefore their livelihoods are also being impacted. So all stakeholders have to be on board, and we have to look at multiple approaches to ensure that that is done. And that is what we are embarking on.
That's great. Thank you. We have a minute or two more. I don't know if any other panelists. Oh, we have a question from the audience. How can social protection programs be better designed to meet the needs of women, girls, and children in the context of climate change? Oh, I think we will save that question until we get to our next discussion topic, when we focus in a little bit more on social protection, if that's all right. So stay tuned for that one. With that in mind, we can move on to our next topic. I think if oh, Sebastian, you wanted to complement something further, please go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wondering, in light of what the co-panelists were speaking, do we also try to classify SIDS into poor SIDS and not so poor, So maybe three categories. Some are very akin to OECD countries, and some are middle-income countries, and countries like Guinea-Bissau, Comoros are very poor. So therefore, do we also try to see poverty from the perspective of, from a structural perspective of SIDS? Because right now we are dealing with SIDS as a monolith. Maybe we need to go into the structural dimension if you want to strategize better to target poverty elevation and food security. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what would you say then, Sebastian? Like, what would you would recommend that it needs to be looked at from a more structural perspective?
Well, I think the poor countries and the poorest communities, I think, need one approach, because even when we did the social protection study, I mean, that we will share later, we could see that there are distinct patterns linked to level of poverty of each of the SIDS. So therefore, how do you address the structural dimension when we even design social protection, look at international assistance? So I think there are so many elements which I think need to be systematically explored. I think maybe this is not the place to do that, but I just wanted to flag this issue so that people can think about it. Yeah. Thank you.
That's right. The uniqueness of the context, I guess, as well. Then, right, for each particular place, both in terms of those structural aspects, as well as the biophysical features, I guess, of the place as well, being really important to consider, and the specificities of the fisheries. Well, moving to our next question, this one's going to refocus a little bit back on the report and sort of the ideas behind the development of the course that we're talking about today, addressing the climate change and poverty nexus. Tony and Daniela, we worked together on developing the report, and then together with colleagues from the University of the West Indies on launching the course, addressing the climate change and poverty nexus in the context of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. I'm wondering, Daniela, can you tell us a little bit more about the context and motivation for that report?
Sure, many thanks, Alison, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. And I think, Sebastian, yeah, let's definitely take your suggestion and explore it further. I think, I mean, the whole idea behind this report as well as this course is really to pay attention to some of these things that you just mentioned, because I mean, as previously said by the other speakers, we know that climate change is expected to worsen poverty and disproportionately impact already vulnerable groups and those facing inequality, particularly women and indigenous peoples. And let's try to address this issue regarding the question that was put in the chat in a few minutes. But we know that coastal systems in SIDS are particularly prone to these climate risks, and that people who live and work in coastal communities often experience high levels of climate-related vulnerability associated with the combined effect of high levels of exposure and sensitivity to climate variability, the problems with the infrastructure, and we've seen this with the hurricanes happening, and the lack of adaptation options. So climate variability and change can have direct and indirect, sometimes cascading impacts, and can act as a threat multiplier, aggravating other stressors. And here, and I think, Sebastian, you mentioned that various types of poverty, such as chronic and transient poverty, can interact with climate shocks and stresses in different ways, and that compounds vulnerabilities and affects the possibility and choice of response actions. So climate change not only worsens existing poverty and vulnerability through acute shocks and slow onset events, but it also erodes assets and threatens capabilities in unpredictable ways, all contributing to new poverty and vulnerability. And I think that's where social protection comes in and can be a very powerful instrument to deal with some of these issues and to empower the poor and most vulnerable. This is why building adaptive capacity in institutions and supporting local level resilience, and I think Tony is going to address this more in depth, are so important. So for instance, current estimates illustrate that 75% of the extreme poor live in rural areas and depend at least in part on climate sensitive activities, such as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. Some of the worst impacts on sustainable development are expected and are happening already, in small island development states, as some of you already mentioned. So being on the front lines of climate change also means that seeds are important allies in the fight against it. And indeed, I mean, 95% of seeds recognize the need for strengthened climate change adaptation in the agricultural sectors, and this is expressed in their nationally determined contributions. And seeds are also at the forefront of initiatives to better define the global goal for adaptation. And I think this is very, very important, and other countries definitely should follow. No, we recognize the need to support capacity building and technology transfer that is appropriate to the scale and unique conditions for different seeds, as well as the need to support better recognition of and support for loss and damage experienced by seeds, and the need to support a more just transition, now including to address significant global deficit in adaptation finance to low and middle income countries and seeds. And I think, Sebastian, part of the issue that you raised relates to that, to the finance aspect, the climate finance aspect of it. So an integrated approach to addressing this climate change and poverty such as that we are proposing and that we designed the report and the course is really to try to focus on support, to achieve adaptation strategies and targets that at the same time link to the SDG. And here SDG 1.5, for instance, is very important because it focuses specifically on the need for building the resilience of the poor and vulnerable. So with the report and the course, the vision aims at achieving reductions in poverty and inequality, increased resilience and reduced exposure and vulnerability to climate risks, improved climate adaptation, greater and more fairly distributed well-being, more resilient human and ecological systems, and improved disaster risk reduction. So really, the approach has been conceived to provide knowledge on how to create more coherent, effective, and sustainable climate change responses and rural poverty reduction initiatives that build capacity to support national and local initiatives to reduce exposure and vulnerability and to enhance the resilience of the poor and vulnerable. So the core of the report and the course propose an integrated climate poverty approach and a series of tools that are available to improve the design and delivery, and ultimately the results of synergies and linkages between climate mitigation and adaptation, poverty reduction, and food security actions. I will turn it to you, Alison, because I'm sure that Tony will have a lot to say about that. Over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Daniela. Yes, Tony, given the context as Daniela provided it, tell us more. How is this addressed in the report? Please.
Well, thank you very much. And, I really am pleased to be part of this panel and with some wonderful speakers on the panel. I'd like to follow on from Daniela, but also from Shelley Ann's very good comments a few minutes ago, and maybe step back for a moment to think about the Sustainable Development Goals. And the increasing realization that you cannot just focus on one of the SDGs. I think those of us who work in the ocean world, we talk a lot about the life underwater SDG, and those who are interested in climate, of course, talk about SDG 13 on climate action. But you can't do one SDG by itself, and I think that underlies the basic nature of what we're talking about with this nexus or interaction between climate and poverty, and not just poverty, but also food insecurity, not just food insecurity, but also decent work, not just decent work, not just all of those, but also gender equality aspects. So, when we talk about SDG 13 on climate action, we're really needing to link in with SDG 5 on gender, SDGs 1 and 2 on poverty and food security, and number 8 on decent work. I know it's a lot of numbers to be throwing out with these SDGs, but fundamentally, it's this intersectionality or this interaction, this interconnectedness of what we're trying to do to make a better world, to put it in a kind of big terms. So fundamentally, as I think all the speakers have pointed out, and Daniela just now, we're trying to look at, while knowing that climate has a huge impact on people's vulnerability and on the capability to make a livelihood, a sustainable livelihood. We know they're so well documented, and they've just been reiterated so far today, I think, as well. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do, I think, in the report, which is publicly available on the FAO website, and I think we can put a link in sometime for those who are watching this. Fundamentally, the report and the course, which is going to be discussed more coming up soon, are trying to look not really at the what I might call the impact nexus. In other words, the impacts of climate on vulnerability and poverty and food insecurity, but the response nexus, the interaction of the responses to climate, which we would typically call mitigation and adaptation, and the responses to poverty and food insecurity through various development approaches. So in some sense, at times we talk about the climate agenda and the development agenda in the sense of how do these come together in a coherent way. And so if I can give a little idea about the nature of that framework, of that Nexus framework that we've been talking about, we really focused in on 5 major elements that we think are important to focus on when we're thinking about the responses to climate and the responses on the development side. The first 2 elements reflect that kind of logical idea of bringing development thinking into the climate agenda and vice versa, bringing climate considerations into the development agenda. The third element is about creating synergies of climate and development within various institutions, governments, economic sectors. The fourth element focuses in on the institutional side, the coordination and coherence within and across government and institutions. And the fifth element addresses the importance of the local level for integrating climate and development responses. And again, that has been tested and elaborated through the learning course with a focus on the Caribbean that's going to be discussed soon and is now launching on a really global basis. But I'd like to just elaborate a little bit more on those 5 elements in the framework. So the first element is about developing pro-poor approaches to climate mitigation and adaptation to make sure the vulnerable benefit from these climate actions. The second element would include, for example, climate smart agriculture and aquaculture through approaches that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those activities to the extent that they're there. And, as we all know, small scale fisheries in particular have a very relatively low climate impact already. The third element about synergies is, I think, an important example comes back to small scale fisheries. And the idea of a synergy is how do you get something beneficial on the climate side and on the development side at the same time? Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that the more you focus on small scale fisheries, the more that fishery resources are available in the direction of small scale fisheries, the more you contribute to human well-being by reducing vulnerability and improving livelihoods, and the more you are reducing the fuel-intensive nature of fishing activity. So, I think small-scale fisheries have a lot to say in that regard. And just very quickly, the fourth element's about institutional coordination, and progress on that can come from efforts within governments, for example, to link climate and ocean and livelihood factors. And finally, the fifth element is about supporting this nexus of responses to climate and development at the local level. I think I'll be able to come back on that a little bit more later in this session. So thank you very much, Alison.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. It's great to hear a little bit more about the some of the structure and approach, thinking about the different ways that we can integrate climate considerations into poverty reduction and vice versa, and then other initiatives that are sort of taking a more integrated approach of both together. Daniela, can you give us a brief overview, just thinking now about the course? What does the course cover and how is that organized, building from the report?
No, thank you, Alison, and thank you, Tony. Because I think listening to Tony, and of course being involved and engaged in the preparation of this report and this course, I think I'm really happy, because I think we are really making a difference towards climate justice. In terms of the course, both course development and the report development, we spent a significant amount of time engaging with experts from diverse areas of expertise, and we are very happy with how the course brings together and showcases some of these diverse perspectives and knowledge of the many contributors we engaged with. Now, we are also very pleased to be collaborating with colleagues from the University of West Indies, as Renata mentioned earlier on the first regional application of the course. So very briefly, the online material for the self-paced course consists of 5 e-learning lessons. So each lesson is designed to support learners with diverse areas of specialization and experience, bridging the knowledge between climate-related and poverty-related themes, as well as to stimulate thinking and reflection. So this supports a better understanding of the nexus and how to address it. And I think Tony gave us a very good flavor of it. So the first lesson provides an introduction to climate change processes and climate risks and impacts for coastal communities and small-scale fisheries. The second lesson introduces to poverty and vulnerability and their interactions with climate change, with a focus on small-scale fisheries and coastal communities. So these 2 lessons, basically, we go more in depth in terms of the climate process, and then as well as in the context of poverty. The third lesson describes then the Nexus approach and develops a coordinated approach for addressing these interlinked challenges of climate change and poverty as the climate poverty approach. Now, it introduces us to and explains a variety of tools that can be applied to help bring together and bridge and integrate adaptation and poverty reduction approaches. And one of them is like the vulnerability assessments that we mentioned earlier on. So it includes tools to support mainstreaming, build coherence, and foster engagement at different levels and from multiple starting points. The fourth lesson is about building adaptive capacity and coherence at the organizational level for climate poverty approaches. So several frameworks and tools to support reflection and planning are introduced and discussed, with a focus on integrated approach for the fishery sector and coastal communities. And I think one of our speakers will give more details about that later on. And finally, the fifth lesson focuses on transformation, building resilience, locally led adaptation, and poverty reduction. It includes finance for climate poverty approaches, implementation considerations, and steps for developing a climate poverty action proposal. So throughout, a key feature of the material is that it functions as a resource reference or resource hub for the climate poverty concepts and tools. So each lesson highlights and provides links to a broad range of additional learning resources and implementation guides on topics related to the climate change and poverty nexus that have been developed by FAO and in collaboration with other organizations, including some that focus on small-scale fisheries and coastal communities, as Tony just mentioned. Over to you, Alison.
That's great. Thanks, Daniela. I'm just noticing we have a question here in the Q&A, and I'm just looking for the link here to send to you. So the question is, how can SIDS make use of the course launched here at national and coastal community level? Well, the course is available and it is free and available for everyone to take. I will add the link here into the webinar chat. Just as I'm doing that, I want to go back now to Shelly-Ann to ask you a follow-up about this. So Shelly-Ann, as a program director for the Poverty Reduction and Coordinating Unit at the Planning Institute of Jamaica, you provide oversight and technical input to the implementation of the National Poverty Reduction Program, and you interact regularly with a number of national level committees. You're also one of the alumni from the course, the first pilot that was carried out in the Caribbean. In your work, I know that you've begun to bring forward climate considerations as a key issue to be incorporated into planning and programming for poverty reduction from the national to the community level. I'm wondering, can you share a little bit more with us about this experience? What is your view? What do you see as the importance of this integrated approach, and how is this working? Like what are the steps that you're taking to integrate this, the climate and poverty reduction lens, as Tony and Daniela have been explaining a little bit about what it is? Maybe you can tell us now, how do you put it into practice?
Okay, thank you, Alison. I think, as Tony said, it is really a development issue that we are looking at, and there are a number of interconnections, and we cannot look at one without the other. So my experience being a part of this course, I believe it was a good one, pretty eye-opening, because of the issue of Nexus. So pretty much most persons specialize in an area and they focus on that area, whether it is social protection, whether it is climate change. But having to look at these two issues that really are so interrelated, then we have to really zoom in whichever side we are on. So I believe that the Nexus is important because it helps to strengthen coherence among climate change, fisheries, poverty reduction, social protection, disaster risk management, and other policies and programs. It is also important in building awareness of the issues among a wide range of stakeholders. Those focused on climate change will gain a better appreciation of how the poor and vulnerable are disproportionately affected. And this can impact the scope and focus of policies and programs, as well as the approach to implementation of the appropriate strategies, including from the policy level implementation down to the community development level and the community approaches. On the other hand, the social protection and poverty reduction policy makers and practitioners can also gain greater appreciation, factoring in the impact of climate change on economies, livelihood, and the most vulnerable. Again, this knowledge, dialogue, and appreciation can strengthen social protection responses, as well as programming and targeting. We also have to remember that we are SIDS, and because we are SIDS, then all that affects the climate change issues that affect us will definitely also affect our poverty levels within countries. We also have to ensure that we consider that coastal communities are prone to poverty and social deficits. So as we look at addressing the issues around climate change, then it becomes very pertinent that we ensure that we include impacts on these vulnerable groups. Thousands of fishers and their families are vulnerable to income security risks. We must also bear that in mind. And we also must look at the fact that several of them are informal sector workers. And so we have to identify ways to address those needs. With regards to the integrated approach, Alison, I believe it's not that we have not been doing integrative approaches. There are several systems and committees that we have in place. Even outside of the course, we have a National Social Protection Committee, and that committee has been focusing on the issue of climate change and how it affects poverty and some of the responses that are needed in order to strengthen our work in that area. Even also from the climate change perspective, we also have several committees that ensure that the issue of social protection is being brought to bear, and that we have wide ranges of stakeholders, including those within government, non-government. We also ensure that we have persons from the sustainable development area being integrated into the issues related to social development areas, poverty reduction, and social protection. So the National Poverty Reduction Program Committee is very broad also in its membership and also in the issues and areas that are being addressed. Jamaica has a national social protection, a social protection strategy. And the social protection strategy does look at the issue of climate change and also our response to crises. We also have within the poverty reduction policy and program, ensuring that we look at strategies to strengthen the adaptive nature of communities and families, look at how climate change impacts the poor disproportionately, and how we can ensure that we have specific strategies in order to build resilience and address the issue of mitigation. So coming out of the course, of course, because, you know, I was very impressed, and I believe that the message really resonated, and I wanted to be able to bring that message forward. And so since the course, I have made presentations, you know, reiterating the importance of looking at this very interrelated issue at all levels. And I have made the presentations both to the National Social Protection Committee and the Poverty Reduction Program Committee. We have in Jamaica several committees that are interrelated, and I don't know if I'm supposed to address this further along the line, you know, but I believe I can raise some of those and really put them out there as examples of, you know, approaches that we can take. So the Nexus, it's not a new idea, but it is definitely a very important one that needs to be assessed within countries and also promoted within countries, and whatever level of the system you are and whichever area of the system you are, this recognition is going to be important for the outcomes that we want within our countries, which is, of course, development that is inclusive and development that leaves no one behind, as the SDG mantra says. And we also want to ensure, of course, that, you know, social protection, which is a right, you know, is being featured in everything that we do regarding climate change. Thank you.
That's great, Shelly-Ann. Thank you. I see Sharon, you've got something to say. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Alison. I just wanted to add a bit to Shelly-Ann. I think Jamaica is a bit ahead in terms of pulling some of these ideas together. Where I sit in Trinidad and Tobago and many other parts of the Caribbean and other SIDS, there's still a lot of silo thinking in various ministries that have to manage poverty reduction and environmental impacts. So in fact, what you find happening a lot of times is that these ministries don't necessarily talk to each other very well to harmonize their policies and strategies. And so while we've had a lot of studies to look at impacts of climate change in general, we usually fail at the point of getting persons to adapt and come up with adaptation strategies. And I like the Nexus idea because it focuses on the fact that if you don't meet the needs of the poor in the other dimensions of poverty besides income, then they're not going to be able to adapt. So for example, the other dimensions of poverty would include things like food security, safety, education. So if you have a situation where persons are not well educated, for example, it limits their livelihood options, which can make them even more vulnerable as climate change impacts unfold. So they have to understand at that point that, in fact, the climate change impacts could make them poor if they're not poor now. They could, by choosing or not having good education, put themselves in a situation where they're chronically poor in the long run because of the added impacts of climate change. So I think that the Nexus idea is relatively new for us, the countries who haven't really brought the ideas together, right? It's still relatively new. And I think for communities, they see the climate change impact sometimes as external to their community on a global level or a national level, but not necessarily thinking down to, well, how would it impact my standard of living in the long run? And I think that getting to that conversation with the communities is where the Nexus really helps them to see that it's not just the science aspect, but also impacts on their households. So it's a personal effect that we're talking about. And therefore that requires a personal response on their part in terms of bringing community assets together, getting voices together, and really understanding what their needs are. And the needs will change from community to community. But when they recognize that it is all connected, I think they realize the importance of having to act now and adapting now instead of waiting until another 10, 20, 30 years to do something about the problems that we're facing.
Thanks, Sharon. I see, Tony, you've got your hand up as well. I'm going to say if you can make a really quick remark, that's great. And then otherwise we have to move to the next block of question topics. If you'd like to make just a quick remark now.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Alison. I just following on from these excellent comments that have just come. I realized that I should have I should in describing in particular the report that we put out. I should have emphasized that that the report is not specifically about and the idea of the Nexus is not specifically about fisheries or about coastal areas. Although I must say that we did kind of favor SIDS and coastal areas in the examples that we gave in that report, but the report was aimed broadly, and so just as much for inland agricultural areas, for example. So I wanted to make that point because I think it also ties in with what Shelley-Ann and what Sharon were just saying, that that in some sense it's about an approach that looks at households, looks at communities, as well as national policies and so on, to try to make this linkage. And so for me, I mean, I have a particular, I guess, passion for coastal communities and small scale fisheries, and many of us do. But the idea of the Nexus is really much broader, and so I just wanted to make that point at this stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. That's really important. Good point. So we're going to move on to the next question topic now to focus in a little bit more specifically on social protection and social protection, specifically including shock responsive social protection and social protection as it relates to the small scale fisheries sector. We know that social protection is a human right. It's recognized by international conventions, and that it can be applied using a diverse range of tools that can be combined with other approaches using that Nexus approach. So not only to protect livelihoods and people against the worst impacts of poverty, but also to transform, supporting and enhancing economic inclusion and resilience. So I'm going to ask Daniela, can you tell us a little bit about how FAO sees social protection as an instrument for addressing some of these interrelated issues that we've been discussing?
Sure, thank you, Alison. Yeah, and I think, I mean, we've mentioned social protection quite a lot already, but when we talk about social protection, we are referring to a set of policies and programs, aimed at preventing or protecting all people against poverty, vulnerability, social exclusion, but also in relation to achieving sustainability, and sustainable agriculture management in the broader sense of the word. So there are three pillars of social protection, and we referred quite a lot already here about social insurance, which is a contributory scheme such as pensions, health insurance, other kinds of insurance that have been mentioned. But the other two pillars, which are the social assistance, which is a non-contributory and can be conditional or unconditional cash transfer, is equally important, and very important in the context of the most vulnerable and poor small-scale fisheries, for instance, and also labor market interventions, which aims to build skills and enhance employability and productivity. So it's kind of linking up the cash plus other, in terms of building the capacity and building the skills, so people can really have a better chance, to improve their livelihoods, And I think, I mean, the panelists already said, and I think the example from Jamaica, that effective social protection really requires collaboration, and an interinstitutional arrangement, because it's not a standalone activity. And departments responsible for fisheries and social well-being and health, they need to communicate, and they need to understand and develop multifaceted solutions, and I think this is very key, and it does not happen that often. So from a FAO perspective, so FAO is committed to achieve better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life towards equitable blue transformation. And social protection as a human right, as you said, Alison, is an important mechanism to achieve this goal. So FAO is committed to promoting a systems approach to social protection to avoid any type of fragmentation of interventions, together with partners. And more importantly, it's to build and strengthen nationally owned social protection systems that are well integrated in broader livelihood promotion, fisheries management, and equitable blue transformation. Hence, the importance of achieving coherence between social protection policies and sustainable fisheries management. And FAO just launched a new publication on how to achieve coherence between social policies and fisheries management. And I will put the link to the publication in the chat in a minute. But FAO approach to social protection adopts really a comprehensive outlook that encompasses 4 social protection functions, which is protective, preventive, promotive, and transformative. And I think that's where perhaps the gender becomes very important. And I think there is one question about gender, is really the role of social protection in changing behavior and changing intra-household behavior as well, and empowering those who are not who are powerless within the household as well. But FAO is committed to contributing to the global, regional, and national social protection agendas by strengthening the economic case to expand and scale up social protection systems. So really looking at social protection as an investment rather than as a cost. And in terms of why is it important for the small-scale fisheries, I think we've already covered that. It's due to the different vulnerabilities that they face. Being poverty and marginalization, the migrant status, the income variability which comes with the activity, the issue of gender inequality, the issue that they do not have access to savings, to finance, to insurance. So that really makes them very, very vulnerable. And then social protection really makes a difference. So we've been already focusing a lot on the evidence generation and then trying to understand on how the impact that social protection can have in terms of the socioeconomic aspects, but also on the sustainability aspects, such as the role of social protection in eliminating IUU fishing, for instance, which we looked at a specific case. We did together with some partners, we did an impact evaluation of perhaps one of the biggest social protection programs in fisheries in Brazil, which is the unemployment benefit given to fishers during closed seasons. And the impact evaluation showed us that those households that have actually been receiving the unemployment benefit along the years, they are actually investing in children's education and in youth employability aspects, and also engaging less in IUU fishing. So I think these are some of the, let's say, very interesting achievements that we are seeing when we look at the evidence base of social protection and how that really can transform and build that adaptive capacity of those vulnerable and poor. I have other things that I could address, but I think I will stop here, Alison, now in the interest of time, and then I can come back to some of these issues later. Over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Daniela. And yes, we are running a little bit behind, but we still have time to come back to some of those issues, hopefully. I'm going to move now to Sebastian. Can you tell us a little bit more about this view of social protection as a human right, and how this connects with some of the livelihoods measures? As you touched on, I think at the beginning of your remarks at the beginning of the session, those recommended in the IPCC 6th assessment report. And then maybe you can follow on with that and tell us as well about the global stocktake of social protection for small scale fisheries and SIDS that you've been working on, that ICSF has been doing with FAO, and some of the gaps and opportunities that you've identified. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. I think I'll just try to get into it quickly. If you look at the assessment report 6, it basically talks about 4 types of social protection. One is the risk transfer tool, such as social insurance that Daniela talked about. And second is the the risk retention measures like social assistance. And then the third is a labor market intervention. And the fourth is the livelihood measures. So the fourth one is very interesting, coming from the AR6. And in the review of social protection that we have done in collaboration with FAO, we covered more than 30 SIDS in the African, Caribbean, and the Pacific region. What we noticed is that in the Caribbean region is by and large social insurance program, but in the other 2 regions is mainly social assistance. And secondly, if you look at rich SIDS, I think they have much better social protection than poorer SIDS. And if you come to very poor SIDS, you notice that they are very much reliant on informal community-based, like Wantok in Papua New Guinea, then similar systems in Comoros, or in remittances from people working in other countries. So it's very poor countries do not necessarily have a social protection system. And then the poorest, we noticed, are very much supported by international projects like ILO, World Bank, in countries like Comoros, Sao Tome, Principe, Cabo Verde. So these are some of the examples we have in the study. So, so therefore, if you look at livelihood measures, we have some examples even in our survey. For example, some of the Pacific countries, the people are allowed to migrate to New Zealand as seasonal workers. And there are several countries in the Pacific that permits that. And this is a bit like a livelihood measure for those people. They give remittances back, and that is used for the family's social protection. So therefore, that kind of a thing perhaps can be further developed. And if you look at the assessment report, it gives several examples of livelihood measures. It talks about weather index insurance. It talks about housing. It talks about aquaculture, tourism as alternatives. So these are some of the kind of examples it is giving under livelihood measures. I think these are, again, things which we have to go into very carefully, because knowing fully well that most of the SIDS are very small geographic entities, we can't necessarily approach them from a sectoral perspective, as I think Tony also due to that, his presentation earlier. So therefore, we need to see how we can combine different sectors and maximize, the welfare aspect to the community, and then see what kind of social protection should be contextualized. Again, this requires, from a human rights approach, I would say that we should move away from a top-down approach to social protection to more a bottom-up approach. So there should be more awareness about the role of social protection. And there should be a greater awareness of what kind of social protection would fit into that particular country's economic context or in the social context. Maybe some indigenous communities can have a better system designed by their own kind of authorities within that community, as against some places where people are mostly migrating to other countries and sending remittances back. And so I think we need to contextualize these things better, and then try to see whether one can try to have a more bottom-up perspective. And then I would also stress the importance of I think Daniela also talked about earlier, the importance of coordination and cooperation between different ministries and departments, because as I said earlier, since they are not large geographic entities, we need much greater cooperation in SIDS than maybe in larger economies where you can have more a sectoral approach to social protection. Therefore, how do you work in a coherent manner for these different agencies to work together? And then again, multi-hazard early warning systems are in place in many countries, but again, only some countries have something which is targeting to the fisheries sector. So can you really, wherever the fishing is threatened by cyclones, for example, can you really target the multi-hazard early warning systems to help fisheries to have maybe 15 days warning before the boat goes out? So these are important issues to be considered. And in this context, I would also like to bring in the recent WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies, which talks about subsidies for disaster relief under Article 11.1. So I think the reconstruction subsidies are permitted. So if you really have a problem with resources moving away from the near shore traditional fishing grounds, can you actually use these kind of provisions to support the fishing sector to access those resources without necessarily violating an international agreement? Therefore, I think these are very creative ways of looking at how the subsidies instrument also can be used. So I think there are so many, and I think the COVID perhaps is the one reason why people have got some a more positive outlook on social protection, because some of the countries we didn't covered in the survey, they first started engaging with social protection through the COVID-19 recovery measures or the response measures. So therefore, I think this is a fillip. I think we should see it as a fillip and try to build upon that. Whether one can try to make it mainstream social protection into the thinking of the community. And last but not the least, I think it's also important that we not only focus on the ex-ante measures, we also look at the ex-post measures, because ex-ante measures may lead to certain degree of automation of response. But then ex-post measures may require how do you assess the loss suffered by the community, by the fishing sector, by other sectors, and then how do you look at the labor market in a coherent manner? I think so. Therefore, you need to compensate those kind of impacts. And in that context, a Rio Principle 7 is very important. That common but differentiated responsibility. So I think international community should definitely come to the rescue of countries which are very badly affected by climate change impacts and try to create a fund. And then how this fund is utilized should be very contextually designed with very active participation of people in the fishing communities and other communities. And another point which I would like to highlight is that the social protection coverage of women in general seems to be not so good. So we need to also strengthen the coverage of women in social protection programs. So therefore, I think there are so many areas which are kind of flagged by our kind of survey, and I think needs a much greater kind of engagement in future to develop programs, strategies, policies, so that we can feed into even the overall governance structure, which Alison, you referred to at the beginning of this panel discussion. So therefore, I think at so many levels we need to move, and I think there are enough information which is now coming out of various engagements to give some handles to work with. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Sebastian. Shelley-Ann, did you want to add anything here on your own work on the gaps and opportunities that you've noted around the challenges? I think you've spoken to this a little bit before, but if you Yeah. Did you want
Yes, certainly, Alison. The climate change poverty framework recognizes that public participation and the collaboration principle is important. The development of strategies and approaches to address climate change will engage interested and relevant stakeholders, which includes the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, including women, children, and the poor. I basically just want to highlight, and I mentioned some already, gaps and opportunities as it relates to firstly the Nexus, and then I will quickly look at some gaps and opportunities particular to fishers and fishing communities and coastal communities as well. So in terms of the gaps and opportunities related to the Nexus, I did mention the multi-sectoral approach that is needed, not just in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean. And for example, in Jamaica, we have a national Disaster Risk Management Council, and on this council we have our Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management. We have the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development, the Planning Institute, and other entities. We also have a climate change focal point network that is also multi-sectoral, a climate change advisory board that provides recommendation and technical advice to the cabinet. We also have the hazard risk reduction and climate change thematic working group. So there are a number of groups that at various levels, including at the policy level and the program implementation level, that recognizes that in order for us to respond adequately, we must be talking with all stakeholders. We also see the need for ensuring that we have the fisheries and the non-government sectors and advocates at the table. That is going to be critical to ensure that, you know, the voices of all stakeholders are heard. There is need for greater diffusion of information and early warning systems. Also simplifying registration systems and integrating and identifying systems for social security. Also, integrated information systems are critical for the delivery of social protection. Customized social security modalities for contribution are also critical, as well as creating community networks through organizations close to the community. I also want to highlight here the importance of monitoring and evaluation. We need to ensure that we design our M&E systems to further capture evidence and feedback on the effectiveness of an adaptive social protection approach. We must also look at, I did mention the climate assessment, so we have to bear those in mind, as well as the early warning systems. We also need to look at combining the long-term studies as long-term study on poverty impacts and social response to climate change with trends and projections of future climate change hazards. I will mention lastly now the specifics related to the vulnerable groups. We must take a targeted approach to bring into focus the unique needs and vulnerabilities of fishers and coastal communities. This includes looking at the seasonal nature of fishing, leading to income loss, high level of informality, low levels of participation in social insurance schemes, high levels of poverty in fishing communities. And in Jamaica, we have poverty community profiles. And from those community profiles, we can pick up some of that information. So some of the considerations quickly, including coverage extension plan and customized service delivery plan for fishers and similar categories of workers. We must also, in the event that we don't have this, have a formalization transition plan of action, which involves a plan of action for fishers. And in Jamaica, we have already articulated this through our Ministry of Labor and Social Security. Effective partnerships in registration, including linking into national identification systems, also registries of farmers and fishers. We must also look at utilizing and strengthening pertinent representation on existing social protection and industry-related committees, and technical input is needed there. Support to target groups in creating viable business units, increasing registration to livelihood affiliated groups, strengthening training and employment opportunities to improve access to supplementary employment in off-peak seasons, and building awareness and access to social assistance programs, national insurance schemes, and other social protection provisions. So it's a whole host of integrated and interconnected approaches, but also targeted approaches to bring them everyone into that social protection network where there are provisions, labor market related, social insurance, social assistance, health, etc., in order to address all the various needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley-Ann. That was great. As we've heard, the situation is complex and context specific, and conditions are ever changing. We know that addressing it takes integrated and flexible approaches. Social protection, as we've discussed, is a big part of this. And as Shelley-Ann has mentioned that, and then also the assessment is another big part of it. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes here. We're just approaching the end of the session, but for our final question, I wanted to ask you, Sharon, to share with us a little bit about the recent climate poverty vulnerability assessment that you carried out, and what you can share with us quickly about the process and the lessons that have emerged. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. We just completed a rapid vulnerability analysis on a small coastal community on the west of Trinidad, and we were able to work with the local village council, which is an informal group of community members, to allow us to do focus groups with women and with the larger community. And we were also able to have an engagement workshop with students in the primary or elementary school, as well as the larger community. And what we found is that several people still don't understand very well the impacts of climate change that could happen on their community. They're understanding it at a broader global level, but they're not necessarily seeing it coming down to their community level. We also found that the perspective of the women was very important, because they also allowed us, they also highlighted vulnerabilities with the children, especially when it came to accessing meals, for example, or accessing money to go to school. So many things that didn't really come out when you spoke to the broader community. So having that session with the women was very important for us, because it gave us a better perspective about what was happening with the more vulnerable in the community. Finally, interacting with the youth was very important as well, because many of the young people were thinking about, after elementary school or primary school, that they would just quickly get into fishing to make a quick dollar, not thinking too much about investments in education for themselves. And we saw that as a big problem. And then we also started to ask them about, if the fish stock had continued to decline, what other options would they have for a job, for making money, and so on. So it was good to get them to start thinking about it, because we essentially reminded them that they are the future. They are the ones who are going to lead their communities, and they also have to start thinking early about climate change impacts on their community. Back to you, Alison.
Thanks, Sharon. That was great. We are getting close to the end of time. I just want to ask one final question to you, Tony. Can you tell us a little bit more about the question of scale and local level action? I see that you've put a few things in the chat there. I wonder if you'd like to elaborate for a minute.
Thank you. Well, yes, very, very quickly. The report and the course, I think it's fair to say, are looking at multiple levels of action, and that ranges right from literally the international level, but particularly the national level. right down to local communities and municipalities in some cases. So, you know, as I mentioned, I have a particular kind of passion, I guess, for local communities and what they can accomplish. In the chat, I put some resources that relate to environmental stewardship activities that have that synergistic effect of increasing livelihood security, but also reducing climate impacts potentially through sort of careful thinking about what you can do with your local environment to, for example, with mangroves in the tropics to reduce climate impacts, but also include increase the sustainability of fishery resources. So, you know, there's a number of different actions at the local level. I think the report particularly, you know, emphasizes, and all the speakers I think have spoken about that local level as crucial. But of course, a national level is not only crucial in its own right, but crucial for empowering local communities to do that action. And we've heard about bottom up and top down social protection. I think you can say the same thing with, let's say, conservation measures. Some can come from central sources, but some can be initiated at the community level. And so making all that happen, I think is what we're aiming for with this Nexus approach of basically trying to integrate the thinking about development and the thinking about climate. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Alison.
That's great. Thank you, Tony. I know we could continue on with lots more discussion with this excellent panel, but we are going to have to wrap it up now. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to panelists, everyone, for your excellent contributions and comments. This has been a really rich and interesting discussion. We've had an introduction to the climate poverty nexus theme and its relevance for the Caribbean, including some of FAO's work and perspectives in the region. We've heard a little bit about the recent virtual course pilot in collaboration with UWI's new Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilient Development and CERMES, and about the new self-paced version of the course, which the link is there in the chat. You can please find that, or you can also Google addressing the climate change and poverty nexus, and the course will come up as well as the report. We've heard about some practical examples of processes and tools, about social protection, about assessments, and we've heard about the value of action and engagement at all levels, from place-based local level action to national and broader regional level, and the key role of engagement. So we invite you to follow the link to the course page to explore some of the other resources and to keep up the discussion and keep thinking about this. So I would like to extend our thanks to the organizers for putting together this day, to our excellent technical support team, and to you, the audience, for joining us today in this dialogue, for your thoughtful comments and questions. There's another really excellent session following this one in about 30 minutes time. That one focuses on decarbonization pathways and climate neutral diets with aquatic foods. And that's it for us today. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Stay safe.